The blood-red sun dipped low on the horizon as Kendrick Blackburn leaned against the weathered post of Willow Springs' only saloon, watching a sight that made his blood boil. 5 women, bound at the wrists with rough rope, were being paraded down the dusty main street like cattle. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion and fear, clothes tattered from what must have been a long and arduous journey. The year was 1878, and even in this lawless corner of Montana territory, the sight of human beings sold like property turned his stomach. Kendrick had ridden into town that morning with his saddlebags heavy with gold from 5 years of backbreaking work at his claim. At 32, he'd finally struck enough to buy that ranch he'd been dreaming of since he left his family's failing farm in Missouri at 18. But now, watching the slave trader barking prices at the gathering crowd of rough-looking men, his plans were about to change forever. "$500 for the lot," shouted a bearded man in a filthy duster, his voice slurring from whiskey. "Not by half," responded the trader, a weasel-faced man named Silas Thornton who was known throughout the territory for his unscrupulous dealings. "These are fine women brought all the way from the east. Good breeding stock, strong workers." Among the women stood one with copper hair that caught the dying sunlight. Despite the dirt on her face and the fear in her eyes, she stood tall, her chin raised in defiance. When one of Thornton's men shoved her forward, she didn't stumble or cry out. Instead, she fixed him with a glare that would have withered a lesser man. Kendrick's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip. He'd seen many ugly things in his years on the frontier, but this was beyond the pale. These weren't willing mail-order brides or women of ill repute choosing their profession. These were captives, and in the United States of America, no matter how wild the territory, slavery had been outlawed for years. As he watched, the copper-haired woman leaned toward a younger girl beside her who was trembling uncontrollably, whispering something that seemed to steady her. The sight cemented his resolve. Kendrick pushed away from the post and walked purposefully toward the gathering. The crowd parted, familiar enough with his reputation to give him a wide berth. Since coming to Willow Springs, he'd earned a name as a fair man but a dangerous one to cross. "Thornton," Kendrick called out, his voice carrying across the street. "What price for all of them?" The slave trader's eyes gleamed with greed as he assessed Kendrick's well-worn but quality clothing and the obvious strength in his frame. "For you, Blackburn, 3,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was an outrageous sum, enough to buy a sizable ranch with good water rights. 2,000, Kendrick countered, "and I want papers saying they're free women." Thornton laughed. "These ain't slaves, Blackburn, they're indentured for passage costs, all legal like." "I've seen your version of legal before," Kendrick replied coldly. 2,000, gold, now." The copper-haired woman's eyes found his, a question in them. Not gratitude, yet she was too smart for that, but a wary hope Thornton pretended to consider. 2,500 and not a penny less. Kendrick knew he was being robbed. 2,500 was every ounce of gold he'd painstakingly collected, every dollar he'd saved from breaking horses for ranchers, every cent of his future. But looking at those women, he couldn't walk away. "Done," he said flatly. "But I want those papers drawn up proper by Judge Wilson before any gold changes hands." An hour later, after a tense meeting in the judge's office where Thornton's claims of indentured servitude fell apart under scrutiny, Kendrick walked out with 5 women following behind him, officially free according to papers that the judge, no friend to human trafficking, had been all too happy to draw up. The copper-haired woman fell into step beside Kendrick as he led them toward the hotel. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice lower and more cultured than he'd expected. "No one deserves to be owned," he answered, not slowing his pace. "I'm Katherine Grayson," she said. "Those men killed my father and took us from our wagon train 3 weeks ago." Kendrick stopped and looked at her properly for the first time. Up close, he could see her eyes were a clear green, and despite the hardship she'd endured, there was an unmistakable intelligence and strength in them. "Kendrick Blackburn," he replied. "I've got rooms for you all at the hotel, food, clean clothes. Then you can decide what you want to do." "And what will you do, Mr. Blackburn, now that you've spent your fortune on strangers?" The question hit him like a physical blow. The ranch, the horses, the future he'd planned all gone. But looking at Katherine Grayson's face at the four other women now free to choose their own paths, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "I'll start over," he said simply. "It's what we do out here." What Kendrick didn't realize as he arranged accommodations for the women was that his act of sacrifice had set in motion events that would change not only his life, but the very fabric of Willow Springs itself. And that Katherine Grayson, daughter of a Boston scholar who'd sought a new life in the West, would soon prove herself to be unlike any woman he'd ever encountered. The following morning, Kendrick sat alone at a corner table in the hotel's small dining room, nursing a cup of coffee. The gold was gone, handed over to Thornton, who had ridden out of town immediately afterward. Kendrick's dreams had ridden out with him. "May I join you?" He looked up to find Katherine standing beside his table. She was transformed from the day before. Someone had found her a simple blue dress that complemented her coloring, and her copper hair was neatly braided. Without the layer of trail dust, her skin was fair, with a sprinkling of freckles across her nose that softened her otherwise serious expression. "Please," he gestured to the chair across from him. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded on the table. "The others are still sleeping, they needed it. And you didn't." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I find sleep difficult since the attack." Kendrick nodded, understanding all too well how violence could haunt one's dreams. "I want to thank you properly," Katherine continued. "What you did, I've never seen such selflessness." Kendrick shifted uncomfortably. "Any decent man would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't. A dozen decent men stood in that street yesterday and saw us as property to be bought." He couldn't argue with that. "What will you do now, Miss Grayson?" "Katherine, please." She took a deep breath. "I need to get to San Francisco. My mother's sister lives there." The others have different destinations. Sally and Meg were traveling to Oregon Territory to meet husbands they've corresponded with. Ruth wants to return east, and Eliza, she's just 17 and has nowhere to go. "The stage comes through on Thursday," Kendrick offered. "I can arrange passage." Katherine looked at him intently. "With what money, Mr. Blackburn? You gave everything you had to Thornton." He had no answer for that. "I have a proposition," she continued. "I was educated at my father's side. He was a professor of literature at Harvard before he decided the West offered more opportunity. I can read, write, keep accounts, and speak 3 languages. I want to work to earn our passage." "Not much call for professors in Willow Springs," Kendrick said gently. "Perhaps not. But there must be work for someone who can read and write. The telegraph office, perhaps, or as a clerk in one of the stores." Kendrick considered this. "The mercantile might need help. Old man Parker's eyesight isn't what it used to be." "Then I'll speak to him today." Her determination was evident in every line of her body. "And the others can work too. We won't be charity cases, Mr. Blackburn." "Kendrick," he corrected, "if I'm calling you Katherine." For the first time, a genuine smile transformed her face, reaching her eyes and revealing a dimple in her left cheek. "Kendrick, then." Something stirred in his chest at the sight of that smile, a feeling he quickly tamped down. She was bound for San Francisco, and he had no right to entertain thoughts of anything else, especially not when he was now as penniless as the day he'd arrived in Montana. "What about you?" she asked. "What will you do now?" He shrugged. "What I've always done, work, save, start over." "Was it a home you were saving for?" "A ranch," he admitted. "Nothing fancy, just a place of my own, land that no one could take from me." Katherine nodded thoughtfully. "A worthy dream, and one you'll achieve again, I'm certain." Before he could respond, the dining room door opened, and the other 4 women entered. They approached the table cautiously, and Katherine made introductions. Sally Cooper was a sturdy woman in her 20s with practical brown hair and capable hands. Meg Wilson was slightly older, with a quiet dignity about her despite her circumstances. Ruth Bennett was clearly from money, her accent refined, and her mannerisms delicate despite the ordeal she'd endured. And Eliza Dunn was barely more than a girl, with wide blue eyes that had seen too much tragedy too soon. "Mr. Blackburn has suggested we might find work in town while we earn money for our passages," Katherine explained to them. "I can cook," Sally offered immediately. "Worked in a boarding house back in Illinois." "I'm good with numbers," Meg added. "I can sew anything," Ruth said, touching the fine stitching on her torn sleeve that she'd clearly mended herself. Only Eliza remained silent, looking down at her hands. Eliza is an accomplished pianist, Katherine said gently, and she has the most beautiful singing voice. Not much call for pianists either, Kendrick said, but then had a thought. Though the Silver Dollar Saloon does have an old piano gathering dust. Owner's been talking about finding someone to play it for years. Eliza's head shot up. A saloon, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Just for the music, Kendrick clarified quickly. Respectable like the owner, Tom Winters, he's a decent sort. Katherine looked at Eliza with concern. We'll discuss all options, she assured the girl. No one will be forced into anything uncomfortable. As they continued breakfast, discussing possibilities, Kendrick found his gaze returning to Katherine again and again. There was something compelling about her, not just her beauty, which was considerable, but the way she naturally assumed leadership of the group, balancing authority with genuine care. Later that morning, Kendrick walked the women around the small town, introducing them to potential employers. Parker at the Mercantile was indeed in need of help, and was impressed by Katherine's quick grasp of his inventory system. The hotel owner's wife hired Sally on the spot when she demonstrated her cooking skills by improving the stew that was simmering for lunch. At the Silver Dollar, Tom Winters listened to Eliza play a tentative tune on the dusty piano and immediately offered her a position performing during the early evening hours, with the strict understanding that she would be escorted back to the hotel before the rougher element took over the saloon after dark. By midday, all 5 women had secured employment, their determination to rebuild their lives evident in every interaction. As Kendrick and Katherine walked back toward the hotel, a sense of accomplishment between them, he found himself wondering what would have happened if he hadn't been in town yesterday, if he hadn't had the means to intervene. The thought made his jaw clench. "You're brooding," Katherine observed. "Just thinking. About your lost fortune?" "No," he said truthfully. "About what might have happened to you all if things had gone differently." Katherine stopped walking and turned to face him. "But they didn't, because of you. I'm not looking for gratitude, I know." She studied his face. "That's what makes your actions so remarkable. You did what was right simply because it was right." A commotion down the street interrupted their conversation. A group of riders was approaching, and at their head was a face Kendrick recognized all too well, Silas Thornton. "Get inside," Kendrick told Katherine urgently. "Find the others and stay in the hotel." For once, she didn't argue, hurrying toward the hotel while Kendrick moved to intercept Thornton and his men. Thornton reined his horse to a stop in front of Kendrick, his thin face twisted in a sneer. "Blackburn," he spat. "Thought I'd find you here. Thought you'd be halfway to the Dakotas by now, Thornton. Changed my plans when I discovered something interesting about those women." His eyes gleamed with malice. "That redhead, she's the daughter of William Grayson." The name meant nothing to Kendrick. "I see you don't follow Eastern news out here in the wilderness," Thornton continued. "Grayson was one of the wealthiest men in Boston before he decided to go pioneering, his family's offering a substantial reward for the return of his daughter alive or dead." Kendrick's blood ran cold. "You're lying." "Am I? Why don't we ask her? Or better yet, why don't I just take her back with me and collect that reward? You sold her. Legal papers and all." Thornton laughed. "Papers can be lost." "And who's going to believe a penniless prospector over a businessman like me?" Kendrick's hand moved toward his gun, but Thornton's men had already drawn theirs. "I wouldn't," Thornton warned. 5 against 1 are poor odds, even for a man with your reputation." Before Kendrick could respond, the doors of buildings all along the street began to open. Parker emerged from the Mercantile with a shotgun. Tom Winters stepped out of the saloon, flanked by several of his regular customers. And from the hotel came Sheriff Davis, who had been notably absent during yesterday's auction but now seemed very interested in the confrontation. "Problem here, Blackburn?" the sheriff called. Thornton's confident smile faltered as he realized the town was rallying behind Kendrick. "No problem," Kendrick answered, his eyes never leaving Thornton's. "Mr. Thornton was just leaving, for good this time." Thornton looked around at the armed townspeople, calculating his odds. Finally, he spat on the ground near Kendrick's boots. "This isn't over," he hissed, then wheeled his horse around. His men followed, casting dark looks over their shoulders as they rode out of town. Only when they were out of sight did Kendrick allow himself to relax slightly. The sheriff approached, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Heard about what you did yesterday," Davis said. "Couldn't believe it at first, man giving up his whole stake like that." "Did what needed doing," Kendrick replied simply. "Well, those women are under the protection of this town now," the sheriff declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Anyone comes looking to harm them will answer to all of us." A murmur of agreement ran through the gathered townspeople. It seemed Kendrick's act of sacrifice had awakened something in Willow Springs, a sense of community and justice that had been dormant. As the crowd dispersed, Kendrick turned to find Katherine standing on the hotel porch watching him. The look in her eyes suggested she'd heard everything, including Thornton's revelation about her family. The time for secrets was over. As he walked toward her, Kendrick knew that the danger was far from past and that the connection growing between them had just become infinitely more complicated. Katherine's face was pale as Kendrick joined her on the hotel porch. "You heard," he said quietly. "Yes." Her hands were clasped tightly together. "He was telling the truth about my father's wealth, but not about the reward. There isn't one because there's no family left to offer it. My mother died years ago, and my aunt in San Francisco is our only living relative. Thornton doesn't know that. No. And he clearly plans to profit from the lie." She looked up at him, her green eyes troubled. "I've put you in danger, put this whole town in danger." "You didn't put anyone anywhere," Kendrick said firmly. "Thornton did that, and he'll be back with more men next time." Katherine nodded grimly. "Then we should leave, the five of us, as soon as possible. Running won't solve this. Thornton's the type to hold a grudge, he'll track you." "What choice do we have? We can't fight him." Kendrick was silent for a moment, considering their options. "Maybe we can, not with guns, but with the law." "Your father's name, his reputation, there must be someone who can verify your identity, confirm that Thornton's lying about the reward." "The nearest federal marshal is in Helena," Sheriff Davis said, joining them on the porch. 3 days' ride from here. "I could send a telegram, but it would take time for them to respond." "Time we may not have," Katherine said. "We'll make time," Kendrick assured her. "Sheriff, can you post men at the town approaches? Give us warning if Thornton returns," Davis nodded. "Already planned to." And Tom Winters offered rooms at the saloon for the ladies' rooms with a back exit if needed. As they discussed security arrangements, a wagon pulled up in front of the hotel. Dr. James Hammond, Willow Springs physician, climbed down from the driver's seat. "Heard we had some ladies in need of medical attention," he said, grabbing his bag. Katherine looked at Kendrick in surprise. "Sent word this morning," he explained. "Figured after what you all went through, a doctor's visit wouldn't hurt." "Thank you," she said softly, touched by his thoughtfulness. While Dr. Hammond examined the women one by one in a private room, Kendrick sat in the hotel lobby, turning over plans in his mind. The gold was gone, but he still had his skills. He could hire on at one of the ranches, earn enough to get the women safely to their destinations. But that would take time, and Thornton's threat loomed. "Mr. Blackburn?" He looked up to see Eliza Dunn standing tentatively before him. The youngest of the women seemed to have recovered some of her spirit after securing the piano-playing position. "Miss Dunn, doctor finished with you," she nodded. "He says I'm healthy, just underweight." She hesitated, then sat beside him. "I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Why did you do it? Save us." Her blue eyes were earnest. "Katherine says it was because you're a good man, but you gave up everything. Nobody does that for strangers." Kendrick considered her question seriously. "My mother was taken by raiders when I was 12, he finally said, surprising himself with the admission. "My father and I searched for months, but we never found her. I swore then that if I ever saw someone being taken against their will, I'd stop it if I could." Eliza absorbed this. "I'm sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago. Does it ever stop hurting?" The question, so innocent and yet so profound, caught him off guard. "Not really," he answered honestly, "but you learn to live with it, to make something good out of the pain." She nodded as if his answer confirmed something for her. "That's what I thought." She stood. "Mr. Winters wants me to start playing tonight. Will you come?" "Wouldn't miss it," he promised. After Eliza left, Dr. Hammond approached, his expression grave. "Those women have been through hell, Blackburn. Malnutrition, exposure, and signs of physical abuse. The youngest, Eliza, has healing bruises that suggest she fought back against something worse." Kendrick's jaw tightened. "They'll recover. Physically, yes, with proper care and time." The doctor hesitated. The redhead Miss Grayson, she's quite remarkable, been treating the others' injuries with limited supplies, probably kept the youngest alive. She's something all right, Kendrick agreed. She's also hiding an injury of her own, cracked ribs on her left side. Says she fell, but the bruising pattern suggests someone kicked her repeatedly. Kendrick fought down a surge of rage. Thornton or one of his men, she wouldn't say. Hammond clasped Kendrick's shoulder. Those women owe you their lives. They don't owe me anything, Kendrick said firmly. Just want to see them safe. That evening, the Silver Dollar Saloon was unusually crowded. Word had spread that a young lady of refinement would be playing the piano, and townsfolk who normally avoided the establishment made an appearance. Women from the sewing circle, the blacksmith and his wife, even the preacher stood at the back, curious about the rescued women everyone was talking about. Eliza sat nervously at the newly polished piano, her slender fingers hovering over the keys. When she began to play, the saloon fell silent. The music was unlike anything typically heard in Willow Springs, a classical piece that spoke of formal training and natural talent. Kendrick stood near the bar, watching the townspeople's reactions. Many looked genuinely moved. When Eliza finished her first piece, the applause was enthusiastic and sincere. She's quite gifted, Katherine said, appearing beside him. That she is. He glanced at her. Should you be up and about? The doctor mentioned your ribs. Katherine's eyes widened slightly. Did he now? He was concerned. I'm fine, she insisted, and we have more important matters to discuss. Sheriff Davis received a telegram from the federal marshal. He'll be here in 2 days. Good, that's good news. Is it? Katherine sighed. Kendrick, even with official confirmation of my identity, what's to stop Thornton from simply taking what he wants by force? You saw his type. The law means nothing to him. Before Kendrick could respond, the saloon doors swung open and a tall, broad-shouldered man walked in. Gray streaked his dark beard and his clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. At his hip hung a Remington revolver that had clearly seen use. The newcomer surveyed the room until his gaze landed on Katherine. His weathered face broke into a wide smile. Katie, he called out. By God, it is you, Katherine's hand flew to her mouth. Uncle Robert, the man strode forward and swept Katherine into a careful embrace. When I got your father's letter saying you were heading west, I started tracking your wagon train. Found the massacre site 3 weeks back and feared the worst. My father, Katherine asked, her voice breaking, The man's face fell. I know, child, I buried him myself. Katherine's composure finally cracked. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks as her uncle held her. Kendrick stepped back, giving them privacy for their reunion, but Katherine reached out and caught his arm. Kendrick, this is my uncle, Robert Grayson. My father's brother, Uncle Robert, this is Kendrick Blackburn. He saved us. Robert Grayson assessed Kendrick with keen eyes. Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, sir. No debt, Kendrick said automatically. My brother's daughter is all the family I have left in this world, Grayson continued. What you did. He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. As the evening progressed, Grayson explained that he'd been tracking Katherine's wagon train from the east, having received a letter from his brother announcing their journey west. He was a former Army scout turned private investigator with connections throughout the territories. I've been following Thornton's trail for 2 weeks, he told Kendrick as they sat at a corner table. Katherine had gone to check on Eliza, who was taking a break from playing. The man's wanted in 3 states for kidnapping, fraud, and murder. When I heard what happened here in Willow Springs, I pushed hard to reach you before he could return. He's coming back, Kendrick said grimly, made that clear. Yes, but now he'll find more than he bargained for. Grayson leaned forward. I've contacted associates in the territorial government. There's a substantial bounty on Thornton's head that few know about because he's managed to silence those who get close. With your testimony and the women's, we can end his operation for good, if we can catch him. Oh, we'll catch him. Grayson's expression was hard. Men like Thornton always make the same mistake. They underestimate their prey. The conversation was interrupted by Katherine's return. Despite her obvious joy at her uncle's appearance, Kendrick could see the strain in her face, the way she held herself carefully to protect her injured ribs. Uncle Robert was just telling me he plans to take you all to San Francisco as soon as possible, Kendrick said, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in his chest at the words. Katherine looked between the two men. Is that so? It's the safest option, Katie, her uncle said gently. I have a home there, plenty of room for all of you until you decide what you want to do next. And what about Thornton? He'll follow. Let him try. Grayson's hand moved to his revolver. But your safety comes first. Katherine turned to Kendrick, and what do you think? The question caught him off guard. Your uncle knows best in this situation. That's not what I asked. Kendrick met her gaze, seeing the challenge there. I think you should go, he said finally. Get as far from Thornton as possible, start fresh. Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes. I see. Katie, her uncle interjected, Mr. Blackburn is right. There's nothing for you here but danger. Nothing, she repeated softly, her eyes still on Kendrick's. The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken feelings. Then Katherine straightened her shoulders. We'll discuss it tomorrow. I'm tired and my side is aching. Uncle Robert, will you escort me back to the hotel? As they left, Kendrick remained at the table, nursing his whiskey and trying to ignore the voice in his head telling him he'd just made a terrible mistake. Of course Katherine should go with her uncle. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing. He had nothing to offer her, no gold, no ranch, nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation that attracted trouble. Yet as he watched her walk away, leaning slightly on her uncle's arm, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something precious before he'd even had a chance to claim it. The following morning, Kendrick rose before dawn, his sleep having been restless and filled with dreams of copper hair and green eyes. He made his way to the livery stable where his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty, greeted him with a soft nicker. At least you're still with me, old friend, Kendrick murmured, stroking the horse's neck. Talking to horses now, Blackburn, that's a bad sign. He turned to find Sheriff Davis entering the stable, looking grim. Something wrong, Ryder just came in from the North Road. Says he passed a group of about 15 men headed this way. Described Thornton among them, Kendrick cursed. How long? 2 hours, maybe less. The marshal's not due until tomorrow, Davis nodded grimly. I've sent riders to try to intercept him, hurry him along. In the meantime, I'm gathering every able-bodied man who can shoot straight. 15 against what? The handful of men in this town willing to risk their lives for strangers. Not just strangers anymore, Davis pointed out. Those women have made quite an impression in their short time here. Sally's Biscuits alone have half the men in town ready to propose marriage. Despite the gravity of the situation, Kendrick smiled slightly. It was true, in just 2 days, the women had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of Willow Springs. Meg's quick mind had already organized Parker's chaotic bookkeeping system. Ruth had repaired the altar cloth at the church, earning the preacher's undying gratitude. And Eliza's music had brought something beautiful to a town that had little enough beauty in it. And Katherine. Katherine had somehow touched everyone she met with her quiet strength and dignity. We need to get them out of town, Kendrick decided. Now, before Thornton arrives. Grayson's already making arrangements, Davis confirmed. He's got a wagon ready. Kendrick saddled Rusty and rode to the hotel, where he found Robert Grayson loading supplies into a wagon while the women gathered their few belongings. Sheriff says Thornton's close, Kendrick said without preamble. Grayson nodded grimly. We're almost ready. There's a mining camp 30 miles south where I have friends. We can lie low there until the marshal arrives. Katherine emerged from the hotel carrying a small bundle. When she saw Kendrick, she paused, then approached him as he dismounted. You're coming with us, she asked. Someone needs to watch your backs on the trail. She studied his face, and after, when we reach San Francisco, the question hung between them. Kendrick had asked himself the same thing all night. What was left for him in Willow Springs now? His gold was gone, his dream deferred, and yet. One problem at a time, he said finally. Something like resignation crossed her features. Of course, practical as always. Before he could respond, a shout came from the end of the street. A young boy was running toward them, his face pale with fear. They're coming, he cried. Riders from the north, lots of them, Grayson cursed. We're out of time. Everyone in the wagon now, the women scrambled to obey, Eliza helping Ruth while Sally and Meg threw the last of the supplies into the wagon bed. Katherine hesitated, looking at Kendrick. Go, he urged her. I'll ride behind, make sure you're not followed. And if we are, then we deal with it. A rifle shot cracked through the morning air, splintering wood on the hotel porch just feet from where they stood. Kendrick grabbed Katherine and pulled her behind the wagon for cover. "That answers that question," Grayson said grimly, drawing his revolver. "They're already here." At the north end of the street, Thornton and his men had appeared, spread out in a loose formation. Most were on horseback, rifles at the ready. "Blackburn," Thornton's voice carried clearly. "Send out the Grayson woman and we'll leave the rest of you in peace." Sheriff Davis emerged from the jailhouse across the street, his deputy beside him. Both carried shotguns. "This is your only warning, Thornton," Davis called back. "Turn around and leave this town or face the consequences." Thornton's laugh was ugly. "What consequences? I count 2 lawmen and a couple of washed-up cowboys against 15 experienced guns." As if in answer to his taunt, doors opened all along the street. Parker stepped out of the mercantile, shotgun in hand. Tom Winters and 3 of his regular customers emerged from the saloon, armed and grim-faced. The blacksmith appeared with a rifle, and beside him, surprisingly, stood the preacher, holding an ancient but serviceable Colt. More townspeople appeared, men Kendrick knew only in passing, women with determination in their eyes and weapons in their hands. In 2 days, the rescued women had made allies throughout Willow Springs, and now the town was rising to their defense. Thornton's confident expression faltered as he assessed the new odds. "Last chance," Sheriff Davis called. "Ride out now." For a moment it seemed Thornton might reconsider, then his face twisted with rage. "Take them," he shouted to his men. "Kill anyone who gets in your way." The street erupted in gunfire. Kendrick shoved Katherine toward the rear of the wagon. "Stay down," he ordered, then drew his Colt and returned fire. Beside him, Robert Grayson was a revelation, cool and precise in his shooting, dropping one of Thornton's men with his first shot. The sheriff and his deputy had taken cover behind a water trough and were laying down steady fire, forcing several of the attackers to dismount and seek shelter. The townspeople, though less experienced, made up for it with determination and advantageous positions. Parker's shotgun roared from a second-story window, and the blacksmith's rifle cracked with metronome regularity. Kendrick caught glimpses of Thornton moving among his men, shouting orders. His face contorted with fury as his easy victory turned into a pitched battle. 3 of his men were already down, and the rest were pinned behind whatever cover they could find. "We need to move," Grayson shouted over the gunfire. "While they're distracted," Kendrick nodded. "Get the wagon going, I'll cover you." Grayson leapt onto the driver's seat and grabbed the reins. The women were huddled in the wagon bed, fear on their faces but no panic as Grayson slapped the reins. Kendrick laid down, covering fire, forcing Thornton's men to keep their heads down. The wagon lurched forward, heading for the south end of town. Kendrick was about to mount Rusty and follow when he heard Katherine cry out. Turning, he saw her half standing in the moving wagon, pointing back toward the hotel. Eliza was still on the porch, frozen in terror. Without hesitation, Kendrick sprinted for the girl, dodging bullets that kicked up dust at his feet. He reached Eliza and grabbed her arm. "Come on," he shouted. The girl seemed paralyzed, her eyes wide and unseeing. Kendrick realized she was in the grip of some memory, some horror that had robbed her of the ability to move. In one fluid motion, he scooped her into his arms and ran for his horse. Bullets splintered the porch around them as Thornton's men realized what was happening. Rusty stood ground-tied where Kendrick had left him, ears pricked at the commotion but steady. Kendrick managed to get Eliza seated in the saddle, then swung up behind her and kicked the horse into a gallop. They thundered down the street after the wagon, which had already reached the edge of town. Behind them, Kendrick could hear shouting as Thornton ordered his men to pursue. The wagon was moving fast, Grayson handling the team with skill born of experience. Kendrick pushed Rusty harder, closing the gap between them. As they caught up, he saw Katherine's face, pale with relief as she spotted Eliza safe before him. "Keep going," Kendrick shouted to Grayson. "Don't stop until you reach the tree line." A mile south of town, a dense pine forest began, offering cover and multiple trails that would be difficult to follow. If they could reach it before Thornton's men organized a proper pursuit, they had a chance. Gunfire erupted behind them. Kendrick glanced back to see 4 riders in pursuit, rifles raised. One bullet whizzed past his ear, another struck the wagon, embedding itself in the wooden side. "Faster," he urged Grayson. The wagon was bouncing wildly over the rough trail, the women holding on for dear life. Eliza clung to the saddle horn, her eyes squeezed shut. The tree line was tantalizingly close now, perhaps a quarter-mile away. But their pursuers were gaining, their horses unencumbered by the weight of a loaded wagon. Kendrick made a split-second decision. "Take her," he shouted, guiding Rusty alongside the wagon. He practically lifted Eliza across the gap, strong hands Catherine's and Sally's reaching to pull her into the wagon bed. "What are you doing?" Katherine cried, realizing his intent. "Buying you time," Kendrick replied, already wheeling Rusty around to face the oncoming riders. "No," Catherine's voice was anguished, but Grayson never slowed the wagon. He understood what Kendrick was doing, what had to be done. Kendrick positioned himself in the middle of the trail, Colt drawn, Rusty steady beneath him. The pursuing riders slowed, uncertain at this unexpected development. "That's far enough," Kendrick called out. "Turn back now," the lead rider, a hard-faced man with a scar across his cheek, laughed. "One man against four, those are suicide odds, friend." "Maybe," Kendrick agreed, "but I guarantee at least two of you won't live to collect whatever Thornton's paying you." The men exchanged glances, calculating the risk. Behind them, Kendrick could see dust rising, the rest of Thornton's men joining the pursuit. The scarred man raised his rifle. "Nothing personal," he said, and fired. Kendrick was already moving, spurring Rusty to the side as he returned fire. His first shot caught the scarred man in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The second struck another rider in the chest. The remaining two opened fire, bullets kicking up dirt around Kendrick as he ducked low over Rusty's neck and urged the horse into the cover of a shallow gully that ran alongside the trail. He had bought the wagon precious minutes, perhaps enough to reach the forest. But now he was pinned down, with more of Thornton's men approaching rapidly. Checking his Colt, Kendrick grimaced. 2 bullets left, plus the rifle in his saddle scabbard with perhaps a dozen rounds, not enough to hold off Thornton's entire force. From his position, he could see the wagon disappearing into the trees. Relief washed over him. They had made it. Katherine was safe. That was what mattered. Gunfire peppered the edge of the gully, keeping him pinned. Kendrick weighed his options. He could try to make a run for it, use the gully for cover as long as possible, then break for the trees himself. The odds weren't good, but they were better than staying put and being surrounded. He was about to spur Rusty forward when a new sound reached his ears, thundering hoofbeats, many of them, approaching from the south. His heart sank. Had some of Thornton's men circled around to cut off the escape route, but the riders who emerged from the tree line weren't Thornton's men. At their head rode Sheriff Davis and Robert Grayson, and behind them came what looked like half the able-bodied men of Willow Springs. And there, riding beside her uncle on a borrowed horse, was Katherine. The newcomers charged straight for Thornton's scattered forces, who were caught completely by surprise. What had been a pursuit suddenly became a chaotic melee as the townspeople fell upon Thornton's men with righteous fury. Kendrick seized the opportunity, urging Rusty up out of the gully and into the fray. He spotted Thornton almost immediately, trying to rally his men for a counterattack. Their eyes met across the battlefield. Thornton's filled with hatred, Kendrick's with grim determination. As if by mutual agreement, they moved toward each other, the battle raging around them. Suddenly secondary, Thornton drew his pistol. "Should have minded your own business, Blackburn," he snarled. "Those women were my business the moment you tried to sell them," Kendrick replied, his own weapon leveled. "She's worth a fortune, you know, the Grayson girl. Her family in Boston would pay anything to get her back." "There is no family in Boston," Kendrick said. "Just a greedy lie you told yourself to justify kidnapping and murder." Thornton's face contorted with rage. "Liar," he shouted and fired. The bullet grazed Kendrick's temple, hot pain searing across his skin. He returned fire, his shot catching Thornton in the upper chest. The slave trader staggered but didn't fall. He raised his gun for another shot, but before he could fire, another bullet struck him from the side. Katherine sat on her horse 20 feet away, a small derringer smoking in her hand. Thornton looked at her in shock, then crumpled to the ground. The fight went out of his remaining men at the sight of their leader fallen. Within minutes, they had surrendered, throwing down their weapons as Sheriff Davis and his impromptu posse surrounded them. Kendrick dismounted shakily, the adrenaline of battle beginning to fade. Blood trickled down the side of his face from Thornton's bullet, but the wound was superficial. Katherine rode to his side and slid from her horse. "You're hurt," she said, reaching up to touch his temple. "It's nothing." He looked at her in wonder. "You came back." "Of course I came back." Her voice held a note of exasperation. "Did you think I would leave you to die? I thought you'd do the sensible thing and stay safe." "The sensible thing," she repeated, a smile tugging at her lips despite the tension of the moment. "Kendrick Blackburn, for an intelligent man, you can be remarkably obtuse." Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, Kendrick stared at her in astonishment. "What was that for?" "For being the kind of man who would give everything he owned to save 5 strangers," she said simply. "For being the kind of man I could fall in love with." The words hung between them, honest and unadorned. In her eyes, Kendrick saw not just gratitude but something deeper, something that matched the feelings he'd been trying to deny since the moment he first saw her standing tall and defiant in the face of her captors. "Katherine," he began, but was interrupted by Robert Grayson approaching, leading his horse. "That was quite a fight," Grayson said, his tone casual though his eyes missed nothing of the scene before him. "Marshall should be here by sundown, according to the rider we met in the forest." "Good," Kendrick replied, finding it difficult to tear his gaze from Katherine's face. "I was just telling Kendrick that we won't be continuing to San Francisco immediately," Katherine said to her uncle, a challenge in her voice. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I think we all need time to recover from our ordeal, and there's the matter of Mr. Blackburn's gold." "My gold?" Kendrick asked, confused. "The gold you paid to Thornton," Katherine explained. "It rightfully belongs to you. Once the marshal arrives, we can ensure it's returned." "Most of it anyway," Grayson added. "Some was spent, I'm sure, but Thornton doesn't strike me as the type to share his takings with his men, so I'd wager the bulk of it is still in his saddlebags." Kendrick hadn't even considered this possibility. The gold had been written off in his mind the moment he handed it over to free the women. "Even if it is recovered," he said slowly, "it doesn't change anything between us, Katherine. You have a life waiting in San Francisco. Your uncle, your future, my future is mine to decide," she interrupted. "And I found something in Willow Springs worth staying for." The look in her eyes left no doubt as to her meaning. Kendrick felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly took his breath away. "Besides," Katherine continued, "I've accepted a permanent position at Parker's Mercantile. The town needs someone who can keep proper books." Grayson laughed. "You've always been stubborn, Katie, just like your father." He turned to Kendrick. "I had planned to ask if you might consider escorting us to San Francisco given your evident skills, but it seems my niece has other ideas." "Uncle Robert will stay through the winter," Katherine explained. "He has business in the territory that will keep him occupied. By spring we'll have a better sense of where things stand." "Where things stand." The phrase was delicate, cautious, acknowledging that whatever was growing between them needed time and space to develop naturally. Kendrick nodded, understanding and grateful for her wisdom. "Spring is a good time for new beginnings." As they rode back to town, the captive Thornton and his surviving men under heavy guard, Kendrick found himself riding beside Katherine. The other women had been waiting safely in the forest with a couple of townsmen as guards, and now they all traveled together, a victorious procession returning to Willow Springs. "What will you do now?" Katherine asked softly. "With your gold when it's returned," Kendrick considered the question. The dream of his own ranch still called to him, but it seemed different now, transformed by recent events. "I still want land," he said finally, "a place to build something lasting, but I'm thinking now it should be closer to town than I'd originally planned." "Oh." Katherine's tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a spark of interest. "A man ought to be able to ride into town regular-like," Kendrick continued, "for supplies, and maybe to court a certain lady if she were amenable." A blush rose in Katherine's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I think she might be amenable to that arrangement." As they crested the rise overlooking Willow Springs, the town spread before them in the late afternoon light. It wasn't much to look at a dusty main street, weathered buildings, the simple church steeple the tallest structure, but to Kendrick, it had never looked more like home. The federal marshal arrived as promised that evening, bringing with him additional deputies and the weight of territorial law. Thornton and his surviving men were taken into custody, charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and a host of other crimes. As Grayson had predicted, most of Kendrick's gold was recovered from Thornton's possessions, formally returned to him after statements were taken from all involved. The 5 women became local celebrities, their rescue and the battle that followed already taking on the proportions of legend as the story spread throughout the territory. Offers of employment, housing, and even marriage came pouring in, but all 5 chose to remain in Willow Springs for the time being. Sally Cooper took over the kitchen at the hotel, her cooking drawing travelers who previously would have passed through town without stopping. Meg Wilson's organizational skills earned her a position as the sheriff's clerk, bringing order to the chaotic record-keeping of the jail. Ruth Bennett, with her fine needlework, opened a small dressmaking shop that quickly became the pride of the town's ladies. And Eliza Dunn's piano playing at the Silver Dollar proved so popular that Tom Winters built her a proper stage and hired additional security to ensure her performances remained respectable affairs. As for Katherine, she thrived at Parker's Mercantile, transforming it from a haphazard trading post to a properly managed store that soon became the commercial heart of the growing town. Her natural intelligence and education, combined with a newfound confidence, made her an indispensable part of Willow Springs' development. 3 months after the battle with Thornton, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Kendrick rode into town on Rusty. The horse was freshly groomed, and Kendrick himself wore his best shirt and a new hat. At his hip was the colt that had seen him through so many dangers, but today it was there more from habit than necessity. He tied Rusty to the hitching post outside the Mercantile and took a deep breath before entering. The bell above the door announced his arrival, and Katherine looked up from where she was showing fabric samples to a customer. Her face lit up at the sight of him, and Kendrick felt the now familiar warmth that her smile always kindled in his chest. "Mr. Blackburn," she greeted him formally, though her eyes held a personal welcome that was for him alone. "What brings you to town today?" "Business, Miss Grayson," he replied, playing along with the public formality they maintained. "Wondering if you might spare me a moment when you're finished with your customer. Of course, I'll be just a few minutes." Kendrick browsed the store while he waited, noting the improvements Katherine had implemented. The shelves were neatly organized, the inventory clearly labeled and priced. Parker himself sat in a comfortable chair by the stove, his failing eyesight no longer a hindrance to the store's operation now that Katherine managed the day-to-day business. When the customer left with her purchases, Katherine approached Kendrick. "You're earlier than I expected," she said, dropping the formality now that they were relatively alone. "Our ride isn't until Sunday." "Had a particular reason to come to town today," Kendrick explained. "Wanted to show you something if you can get away for an hour or so." Katherine glanced at Parker, who waved her off with a smile. "Go on, girl, store's quiet this time of day." Outside, Kendrick helped Katherine onto Rusty, then mounted behind her. The arrangement was familiar now. They had taken many rides together over the past months, exploring the countryside around Willow Springs as their friendship deepened into something more. "Where are we going?" Katherine asked as they rode out of town. "You'll see," Kendrick replied, enjoying the feeling of her leaning back against his chest. He guided Rusty north along the creek that provided Willow Springs with its name. The water burbled pleasantly, and the cottonwoods that lined its banks were turning golden with the change of seasons. After about 2 miles, Kendrick turned east, following a less traveled trail that wound up a gentle slope. At the top, he reined Rusty to a stop and helped Katherine dismount. Before them stretched a vista of rolling grassland dotted with stands of pine and aspen. The land sloped down to the creek below, where a natural meadow spread along the waterside. In the distance, the mountains rose against the sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "It's beautiful," Katherine said, turning slowly to take in the view. "Is this My land, Kendrick confirmed. Signed the papers yesterday, 500 acres with water rights to the creek. Catherine's eyes widened. Your ranch. The beginning of it. He took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. What do you think? I think it's perfect. She squeezed his hand. Close enough to town, just as you said. Kendrick led her to a particular spot where the view was especially fine. I thought the house could go here, he said, gesturing to a level area protected by a stand of pines. Nothing fancy at first, but solid, room to grow. Katherine nodded, and he could see her mind working, imagining the possibilities. And the barn there, she suggested, pointing to a spot downslope, with corrals extending toward the creek. Exactly what I was thinking. Kendrick hesitated, then reached into his pocket. There's something else I wanted to show you. He withdrew a small leather pouch and placed it in Catherine's hand. She looked at him questioningly, then loosened the drawstring and emptied the contents into her palm. A ring gleamed against her skin, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. It wasn't an extravagant piece, but it represented a significant portion of Kendrick's recovered gold, transformed into something far more valuable. Catherine's breath caught. Kendrick. He took both her hands in his, the ring cradled between their palms. I know it's only been a few months, he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. And I would understand if you wanted more time, but I know what I feel, Katherine. I've known since the day I saw you standing tall and proud despite everything you'd endured. What do you feel? She asked softly, her green eyes luminous. Love, he said simply. I love you, Katherine Grayson, your courage, your intelligence, your compassion. I love how you've made a place for yourself in Willow Springs, how you've helped transform a rough frontier town into a real community. I love that you came back for me when any sensible person would have kept riding for safety. A smile touched her lips at that last point. I've never claimed to be entirely sensible where you're concerned. Thank God for that. Kendrick took a deep breath. I won't pretend I can offer you the kind of life you might have had in Boston or San Francisco. This will be a working ranch, and life out here is never easy. But I promise you this, you'll never be alone again. You'll never have to face danger or hardship without me beside you, and I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you. Tears had gathered in Catherine's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Kendrick Blackburn, she said, her voice thick with emotion, are you asking me to marry you? I am. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Katherine Grayson, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes, with all my heart. Kendrick slid the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into his arms. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the promise of the life they would build together. When they finally broke apart, Katherine rested her head against his chest, her arms around his waist. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Spending your gold to free us that day, Kendrick tipped her chin up so he could look into her eyes. Not for a single moment, he said truthfully. It was the best investment I ever made, even though you nearly died because of it. Especially because of that, he smiled. It brought me you. They stood together on the land that would become their home, watching as the afternoon sun gilded the autumn landscape in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, Willow Springs nestled in its valley, smoke rising from chimneys as the townspeople prepared for evening. 6 months earlier, Kendrick had been a solitary prospector with nothing but a dream and a sack of gold. Now he had something far more precious, a woman who loved him, friends who would stand with him against any danger, and a community that had become home in the truest sense of the word. All because he couldn't ride past an injustice. All because he'd given everything he owned to set 5 women free. As the sun began to set, Kendrick and Katherine rode back to town, her hand resting on his where he held the reins, the diamond on her finger catching the last rays of daylight. Behind them, their future waited on a hillside above a creek called Willow Springs. Before them lay a town that had become, unexpectedly but wonderfully, the place where both their stories would continue together. The wedding took place the following spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the meadows and the cottonwoods along the creek were dressed in their fresh green leaves. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which was held on Kendrick and Katherine's newly built ranch. The house was modest but solid, just as Kendrick had promised a two-story structure of pine logs with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. From the front, the view stretched across their land to the mountains beyond. Stone chimneys at either end promised warmth in winter, and large windows admitted ample light and summer breezes. The ceremony itself took place beneath an arch of willow branches transplanted from the creek that gave the town its name. Eliza played a portable organ borrowed from the church, her skilled fingers drawing music that drifted across the meadow. Sally had outdone herself with the wedding feast, and tables groaned under the weight of food prepared not just by her but by women from throughout the community. Katherine wore a gown of ivory silk that Ruth had labored over for months, embellishing it with delicate embroidery that incorporated wildflowers native to their land. Her copper hair was adorned with a crown of real blossoms, and in her hands she carried a bouquet of early spring blooms gathered by the children of Willow Springs. Kendrick, standing tall in a new black suit, watched in awe as Robert Grayson escorted his niece toward him. The months since their engagement had been filled with hard work building the house, preparing the land, establishing the beginnings of what would become the Rocking Bee Ranch. But seeing Katherine now, radiant with happiness, Kendrick knew that every callus, every aching muscle, every early morning and late night had been worth it. The preacher's words were traditional but heartfelt as he joined them in marriage. When it came time for their vows, Kendrick and Katherine had chosen to speak from the heart rather than recite memorized lines. "Katherine," Kendrick began, taking her hands in his, "I make these promises not just before God and these witnesses, but before the land that will be our home and the sky that will watch over us. I promise to love you through all seasons, through green springs and golden summers, through the harvest of autumn and the quiet of winter. I promise to build with you not just a ranch, but a life filled with purpose and joy. I promise to stand beside you in good times and in hardship, to listen when you speak and to hear even what remains unsaid. And I promise to cherish every day the miracle that brought you into my life." Katherine's eyes shone with unshed tears as she replied, "Kendrick, I take you as my husband with a heart full of gratitude not just for what you did that day in town, but for who you are every day since. I promise to be your partner in all things, to work beside you as we build our dream, to face whatever challenges come our way with courage and faith. I promise to remember always that love is both a feeling and a choice, and I choose you today and all the days to come. And I promise that no matter where life leads us, my home will always be wherever you are." Their kiss, when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, was met with cheers and applause from the assembled guests. Even old Parker wiped a tear from his eye, though he later claimed it was just the spring pollen. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing under lanterns hung from the trees. Eliza sang songs from back east, her voice pure and strong, all traces of the frightened girl she had been now gone. Sally bustled among the guests, ensuring everyone was well fed, occasionally allowing herself to be pulled into a dance by one of her many admirers. Meg and Ruth, both courting young men from town, sat together comparing notes on their suitors' merits. As the evening deepened, Katherine found a moment to slip away from the festivities. Kendrick found her standing on their porch, looking out at the land that stretched before them, silvered now by moonlight. "Having second thoughts, Mrs. Blackburn?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Katherine leaned into him as his arm encircled her waist. "Not a single one," she assured him. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in a year. Last spring, I was traveling west with my father, filled with uncertainty about what lay ahead. And now, Kendrick prompted when she fell silent. "Now I know that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations." She turned in his arms to face him. "I wouldn't change a moment of it, Kendrick, not even the terrible parts, because they led me here, to you, to this land, to this life we're building." Kendrick kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. "Come on," he said when they parted. "We should get back to our guests." "In a minute," Katherine replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I have something to tell you first, a wedding gift of sorts." "Oh." Kendrick raised an eyebrow. "I thought we agreed no gifts. This one couldn't be helped." She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach, still flat beneath the ivory silk of her wedding gown. "We'll be needing that second bedroom sooner than we thought." For a moment, Kendrick stood frozen, unable to comprehend her meaning. Then understanding dawned, and with it a joy so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "A baby," he whispered, his voice catching. "You're sure?" Katherine nodded, her smile radiant in the moonlight. "Doctor Hammond confirmed it last week. Around Christmas, he thinks." "A Christmas baby," Kendrick marveled, drawing her close again. "Katherine, I don't have words." "You don't need them," she assured him, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the strong, steady beat of his heart. "I already know." They stood together on the porch of their new home, the sounds of celebration drifting from the meadow, the future unfurling before them like the land that stretched to the horizon. From a moment of courage and sacrifice had grown love, community, and now the promise of a new generation. As he held his wife in the moonlight, Kendrick reflected that some men spent their entire lives searching for gold in the streams and mountains of the West. But true wealth, he now understood, had nothing to do with the yellow metal that had once filled his saddlebags. True wealth was standing beside him, wearing his ring and carrying his child, and he was, without question, the richest man in the territory. 5 years later, Kendrick stood on that same porch, watching as Katherine led their daughter Clara through the vegetable garden, pointing out the different plants and explaining which were ready for harvesting. At 4 years old, Clara was a perfect blend of her parents' Katherine's copper hair and Kendrick's blue eyes, her mother's intelligence and her father's determined spirit. Behind them toddled 2-year-old Robert, named for his great-uncle who had returned to San Francisco but visited every summer. The boy was still unsteady on his feet, but adamant about following his sister and mother everywhere they went. The rocking bee had prospered beyond Kendrick's most optimistic projections. Starting with a small herd purchased with what remained of his gold after building the house, he had applied the same determination to ranching that had served him well as a prospector. Now over 100 head of cattle grazed the rich grassland, and the Blackburn breeding stock was becoming known throughout the territory for its quality. The ranch employed 4 full-time hands, with more hired during roundup and branding. A bunkhouse stood near the main barn, and a cookhouse beside it where Sally Cooper now presided. She had married Kendrick's foreman the previous year, and their partnership, both personal and professional, had been a boon to the ranch. Willow Springs itself had grown as well, nearly doubling in size as the territory moved toward statehood. Much of that growth could be attributed to the women who had arrived so inauspiciously 5 years earlier. Meg Wilson had married the sheriff's deputy and now served as the town's unofficial historian, recording its development with meticulous attention to detail. Ruth Bennett's dressmaking shop had expanded to include a millinery department and employed 3 assistants. And Eliza Dunn, whose musical talents had drawn admirers from throughout the region, had recently become engaged to a young doctor who had set up practice in town after hearing her perform during a visit. Katherine divided her time between managing the ranch's books and serving on the newly formed town council, where her education and natural leadership had made her an influential voice in Willow Springs' development. She had also established a small school on the ranch, initially just for Clara, but now attended by the children of their hands and neighboring homesteaders. As Kendrick watched his family in the garden, he reflected on how fully his life had been transformed that day in town, when he'd given everything he owned to free 5 women from bondage. What had seemed like the end of his dreams had been merely the beginning of something far greater than he could have imagined. Katherine looked up, caught sight of him on the porch, and smiled that same smile that had first captured his heart when she stood defiant in the face of her captors. She said something to Clara, then made her way toward the house, Robert toddling after her. "We'll gathering again, Mr. Blackburn," she teased as she climbed the porch steps. "Just counting my blessings, Mrs. Blackburn," he replied, reaching out to steady Robert as the boy clambered up after his mother. Katherine's expression softened. "Any particular reason today?" "Do I need a reason? I suppose not." She leaned against the porch railing, absently smoothing Robert's unruly hair as he clung to her skirts. "Though I did receive a letter from Uncle Robert today that might add to your list." Kendrick raised an eyebrow in question. He writes that Silas Thornton died in prison last month, Katherine said quietly. Apparently, he never recovered from the wounds he received that day. Kendrick absorbed this news in silence. He had not thought of Thornton in years, the slave trader's memory overshadowed by all that had come after. I can't say I'm sorry to hear it, he admitted finally. Nor am I, Katherine agreed, though I'm glad justice was served through the courts rather than by our hands that day. Kendrick nodded, remembering the federal marshal who had taken Thornton into custody, the trial that had followed, the testimonies that had ensured he would never harm another person. Your uncle's news doesn't add to my blessings so much as remind me of them, he said. Of how easily things might have gone differently. Katherine moved to stand beside him, slipping her arm through his. But they didn't, she reminded him. You were there that day, you made a choice that changed everything. We all made choices, Kendrick pointed out. You chose to stand up to Thornton rather than submit. You chose to come back for me when I stayed behind to cover your escape. And we chose each other, Katherine finished softly. Every day since, we've chosen this life we've built. From the garden, Clara called out, holding up a basket of vegetables she had harvested under her mother's guidance. Look what I got, Papa, wonderful sweetheart, Kendrick called back. You're a regular farmer. The little girl beamed with pride, then went back to her task, completely at home on the land that would one day be hers. I've been thinking, Katherine said, watching their daughter. It might be time to expand the school. There are enough children within riding distance now to justify a proper teacher. Perhaps that young woman who arrived on last week's stage, the one with the teaching certificate from back east. Kendrick smiled. It was so like Katherine to always be looking forward, planning for the community's needs as well as their own. Whatever you think best, he agreed, though I'd hate to lose you as Clara's teacher. I'll still teach her at home, Katherine assured him. But she needs other children her age, and the other families deserve access to education. Robert, tired of being ignored, tugged at Kendrick's pant leg. Up, Papa, he demanded, raising his arms. Kendrick swung the boy up onto his shoulders, where he squealed with delight at his new vantage point. What do you see, son? Kendrick asked, turning slowly so the boy could survey their land. Horses. Robert exclaimed, pointing toward the corral where several of the ranch's prized breeding stock grazed. That's right, Kendrick agreed. And what else? Cows, trees, big sky, Katherine laughed at their son's enthusiasm. He has your gift for observation, she teased. And your gift for understatement, Kendrick replied with a smile. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, the family gathered on the porch Kendrick, and Katherine seated on the swing he had built as a first anniversary gift. Clara at their feet playing with a doll Ruth had made her, Robert now drowsy in his mother's arms. From this vantage point, they could see the hands bringing the cattle in from the far pasture, dust rising as the animals moved in a steady stream toward the nearer grazing grounds where they would spend the night. The rhythm of ranch life continued around them, predictable in its patterns, yet always offering new challenges and rewards. I received another letter today, Katherine said after a comfortable silence, from a woman in Denver. She read about our story in a newspaper article someone wrote on the 5th anniversary of Willow Springs' famous rescue, as they called it. Famous, are we? Kendrick asked with a chuckle. News to me. Apparently so. This woman is in a difficult situation not unlike what we faced. Her husband died, leaving her with 3 children and substantial debts. Unscrupulous men are trying to force her to sell her property for a fraction of its worth. Kendrick knew where this was heading, and she's asking for help, Katherine nodded. She has skills. She was a teacher before her marriage. I thought perhaps there might be a place for her here, with the school expanding. You want to offer her a position, Kendrick finished. It wasn't a question. And a fresh start, Katherine confirmed, the way we were given one. Kendrick looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who had transformed his life in ways he could never have anticipated. In her eyes, he saw the same compassion that had led her to comfort her fellow captives even in the midst of her own fear, the same determination that had brought her back to fight at his side when safety lay in the opposite direction. Write to her, he said simply. Tell her there's a place for her in Willow Springs if she wants it. Catherine's smile was worth more than all the gold he had once possessed. "I knew you'd say that." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their land, Kendrick reflected that the true measure of wealth wasn't in what a person owned, but in what they gave away. His impulsive decision 5 years ago, giving everything he had to free 5 women he didn't know, had seemed like financial ruin at the time. Instead, it had been the foundation upon which he had built a life richer than anything he could have achieved alone. The Rocking Bee was more than a successful ranch now. It was a home, a family, a cornerstone of a growing community. And as Kendrick sat with his wife and children, watching the day end and a new night begin, he knew with absolute certainty that he would make the same choice again, 1,000 times over, without a moment's hesitation. Some investments, after all, paid dividends that could never be measured in gold.